Vaping whilst driving by itself is not against the law, but that doesn't mean you can't get prosecuted. And the consequences could be far more serious than you realise. That's what I'm talking about today. But first of all, if you're new here and you've got questions of your own, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you receive new videos. For example, today's video came about because of a question by Gary. So as I said, as the law stands, there is no specific legal ban on vaping whilst driving, although the consequences could be such that you face prosecution and even losing your driving licence with a hefty fine. First of all, and I'm sure most of you will agree, although it may not be specifically against the law, vaping is a form of distraction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the types of distraction that you might have whilst you're out driving a vehicle. First of all, there's what we call a visual distraction. This is where there is something in your direct or even peripheral vision which will distract you or impair your observation of the road ahead and the traffic around you. For example, I'm sure you've all seen those big square fluffy dice that some people hang from their rear view mirror. I'm not going to pass any comment as to taste at this point. And whilst there might be a stunning example of a flair for interior design, these are going to be moving around when you're moving the vehicle. This would amount to a visual distraction because it is going to take the driver's attention away from what's happening on the road and around them in the vehicle. If they are so large that they outright obscure part of the road, then this is an outright visual obstruction to what's going on in the road. Secondly, there's what we call a cognitive distraction. This is what you're thinking. If something is happening that makes you think about something else other than what is going on the road around you, then you are mentally distracted from driving the vehicle safely. An example of this might be if you've got a pet that is running around in the car around you. Mentally, you will be thinking about what that pet is doing, whether it's chewing your car seats or urinating on your chairs. Either way, you are going to be cognitively distracted from what's going on the road around you, to the degree, potentially, that you cannot drive that vehicle safely because you are too distracted. Next, we have what we call a biomechanical distraction. This is where you are physically doing something that is not related to the driving to the degree that it's going to distract you from the driving itself. For example, if you have a handbag or a backpack on the passenger seat next to you, whilst there might not be any specific law that says you cannot rummage through the bag to find the CD that you want to play, this is still going to be a biomechanical distraction because you are physically doing something that is completely unrelated to the driving and the surroundings in which you are driving to the degree that it might cause you to lose attention. Hence, it is a distraction. And the final of the four main distractions we have while we are driving are auditory distractions. This is where you have to listen to something to such a degree that it is taking your attention away from the road around you. Think car full of people shouting and screaming. So back to vaping and how it might relate to these distractions and why it matters. Well, arguably, vaping can easily meet at least the first three of these types of distractions. In reverse order, there is clearly a biomechanical distraction going on because you have to reach for the device to pick it up, to use it, and to put it back down again, because obviously, for the most part, your hand should be on the steering wheel. Additionally, and whilst I don't vape myself, so I've got no idea, but I'm sure there are some kind of on switch, off switch, strength switches, levers, all kinds of different things, depending on the device that you've got. Either way, the whole process of using a vaping device is most certainly, in my view, a biomechanical distraction whilst you're driving. Equally, with a cognitive distraction, there's a certain element of thinking whilst looking for the device, picking it up, thinking about maybe the on-off switch or power switch or whatever it is, and using it, and then thinking about where to put it down afterwards. There is certainly a cognitive element to this whole process and action of vaping. So in my view, cognitive distraction is also met by doing this. Finally, and in my view, probably one of the most important ones is that it is a visual distraction. Because as we all know, and now we all recognize, that vaping produces a big cloud of smoke, whether it's pure white smoke, grey smoke, I've even seen coloured smoke before. But vaping, nonetheless, one way or another, is creating a big plume of smoke in the driver cockpit area. Even if you have the window open, and we've all seen smoke bellowing out of a window from a moving car, clear sign that the driver is vaping. If this much vapor is being produced inside of a car, and the windscreen is obviously not that wide of an area, it is a very low threshold test to meet to say that the driver is going to be visually distracted by the plume of smoke that is caused by vaping. So by now you might be thinking, well, this is all very interesting, but what does that have to do with the law on vaping if vaping by itself isn't actually illegal? And the point is this: there doesn't need to be a specific law outright banning vaping, although I suspect there may be one in the future. But as we stand, there doesn't need to be a specific law outright banning vaping for you to be prosecuted for doing it. This is because you could be prosecuted for careless driving, otherwise referred to as driving without due care and attention. So let's talk about what that means. The offence itself is summarised in Section 3 of the Road Traffic Act 1988, which reads as follows: if a person drives a mechanically propelled vehicle on a road or other public place without due care and attention, or without reasonable consideration for other persons using the road or place, he's guilty of an offence. And as usual with legislation, there is a helpful definition of what careless and inconsiderate driving means. And this is where a person is to be regarded as driving without due care and attention if, and only if, by the way he drives falls below what would be expected of a competent and careful driver. And in determining for this purpose what would be expected of a careful and competent driver in a particular case, we look at not only what the circumstances of which he could be expected to be aware, but also any circumstances shown to have been within the knowledge of the accused. So there you can see the legislation is looking at what should be expected from a competent and careful driver, looking at all of the circumstances that he is expected to be aware of. So applying this to our vaping scenario, a competent and careful driver should be expected to be aware that vaping whilst driving is likely to cause a plume of vapour that is likely to obstruct the view whilst driving. So this, I'm sure you'll agree, is a relatively low bar, in that every competent and careful driver should reasonably be expected to be aware that vaping whilst driving is going to cause a plume of vapour within the cockpit area and likely to obscure view. So what this means for the driver is that if they are driving along whilst vaping, there's a very real likelihood that police may stop them and prosecute them for careless driving. And with many offences, there are guidelines set by the Sentencing Council as to what level of fine and punishment should go along with each offence. So let's take a look at what you might face if you are prosecuted and convicted of careless driving.
This is where you all take a crash course, no pun intended, on how a court looks at sentencing an offender. Here we have the Sentencing Council website, and on it you have Sentencing Council guidelines for various offences. Not every offence, but a lot of offences have different guidelines and they are updated frequently. Here we have the guidelines for careless driving, which were updated in 2017. There's a step-by-step process the court goes through to determine an appropriate sentence for an offender. They first look at offence category, which are Category 1, Category 2, Category 3. As you can see, Category 1 is a more serious culpability and more harm caused by the offence. And going down to Category 3, there is a lower culpability and lesser harm. And for each offence, there are different things that the court would consider as to whether there is a higher or lower culpability, greater harm and lesser harm. And Category 2, obviously being that which doesn't fall either into Category 1 or Category 3. So it might be more serious than a Category 3, but not quite as serious as a Category 1, so it ends up in a Category 2. So here you can see culpability is demonstrated by one or more of the following. In terms of vaping, obviously that comes down to this one, carrying out other tasks while driving. But it's not limited to just one thing. It could be one thing in combination with a number of other factors. For example, if you were driving at excessive speed and you were vaping, in other words, carrying out another task while driving, and it's quite clear that you were driving at speed or aggressively whilst vaping, these two would be taken together in determining what level of culpability this offence would fall under. Also, if you were driving a vehicle with very heavy goods, or this one, carriage of passengers for reward, i.e. private hire or taxis, and you were vaping in the car at the same time, this also will demonstrate a level of culpability. The harm factor, as it sounds, is the level of harm that is caused by the offence. So if you've caused injury to somebody and it's deemed to be because you were vaping whilst driving, that's one thing. Damage to another vehicle or property, or as is probably most likely to be argued in this sort of scenario, with a high level of traffic or pedestrians in the vicinity. So if you were driving in a very busy street or there are lots of people around, or both, this is going to impact on whether there is harm caused. The next step in the process is the starting point and the category range for each of these categories we've just discussed. Category 1 being the most serious for careless driving. The starting point is a Band C fine. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the court will also consider disqualification or between 7 and 9 penalty points. 9 being important because when you reach 12 points, the court is obliged to ban you for a minimum period of 6 months in any event, unless you can show exceptional hardship, which I discuss in another video. Down at category 3, we have a Band A fine and 3 or 4 points. So let's look at what those bands mean. Down under fines, you've got the relative bands shown here. Now, as I said, this is between a Band A and a Band C in the level of fine that you could receive. So we are looking at the top 3 sections of this grid here. So a Band A fine would be the starting point, 50% of the relevant weekly income, with a range of anything between 25% and 75%. But for a Band C fine, it could be 150% of the relative weekly income, with a range of up to 175%. Then the court will go on to consider any other factors that may indicate a reduction, reductions for guilty pleas, and then a totality principle. This is where the court is considering more than one thing together.
So I hope you found that overview useful, but I also in some way hope you found it a little bit daunting, because I, for one, firmly believe that whilst you're driving, that's what you should be doing. You shouldn't be vaping, you shouldn't be smoking, you shouldn't be eating, you shouldn't be rummaging through a bag that's next to you, you shouldn't even be interfering with the sat-nav or anything like that. You should pull over to do those things so that you are not distracted whilst you're driving. It only takes just a fraction of a second to be distracted or for your view to be obstructed, particularly if you're driving at speed, for there to be a fatal collision and lots of people get hurt or killed. So the bottom line for me is please don't do it. Not just because you might be prosecuted for it, but because there's a real likelihood of putting other people and yourself in harm's way. So drop your thoughts and comments down below. I'd be interested to hear them. Drop your questions as well. They fuel future videos. And check out my channel memberships if you want more in-depth videos. And I'll see you next time.